Right, so everything's been fully cleaned and it's ready for the new bits. I've put the order in, and while I wait for everything to arrive, I'll make a start on the fuel pump. I removed the clip so I can give both brackets the usual treatment. I did the same with the rubber mount for the fuel filter. I pulled back the clips and removed the fuel filter. It was nice and clean, but I'll still be putting a new one on. Then I stripped the fuel pipes from the pump. These were quite hard, so I'll likely replace these too. The rubber sleeve for the fuel pump was stuck on, but with a bit of lube I was able to persuade it off and strip down the last of the pipework. I don't know, you tell me if this is what healthy supple rubber should sound like. I removed the screw to pull back the cap over the fuel pump points. Then I put 12 volts to the pump to test it. Although it worked properly, the contacts were quite worn, and given how affordable the replacement parts are, it makes sense to swap it out. The points assembly is held on with these two screws. Then I need to unsolder this wire. I soldered the wire onto the new points assembly and refit the screws, making sure the connections were all in the right place. A quick test to check it's working. Now that should last a few more decades, so I refit the cap. I began assembling everything on the bench, starting with the rubber mount for the fuel pump body. I've bought new hoses for all of the ones that are still available, but there's one that I'll need to replace with just normal fuel line. I'm also fitting new hose clips on each one too. I fit the new fuel filter, though I'll need to confirm the orientation of it when I'm fitting it to the bike. I fit the spring back onto the hose and pushed it onto the pump outlet. This is the hose that runs under the frame and through to the carbs. This pipe goes between the fuel tank and the fuel filter and has the padded foam sleeve glued to it. Here's the one pipe I couldn't get a new one for, and it had cracked when I was testing its suppleness, which it clearly failed. So I cut a fresh length of fuel hose to replace it. This section splits the fuel feed off to the two T-pieces on the carbs. This is all just to test fit everything on the bench before I have to do it all again on the bike. Happy with it all, I fit the fuel pump bracket onto the frame, securing it on with the 2 bolts. Then I fed the fuel pump into position, directing the hoses into the right place. The rubber mount just pressed over the lugs on the bracket. The filter bracket mounts onto this bolt, so I temporarily removed the wiring clamp and moved it out of the way to fit the bracket. I connected the fuel pump to the loom, then clamp the loom into place with a cable tie on the bracket. I pressed the filter down onto the hose and fitted the clamp. Then I tightened up the bracket. The last piece of the puzzle is the pipe to the tank, which goes behind the shock mount and onto the top of the filter. Well, Mr. Kawasaki sure packs it in under here. Here's the outlet lead that will eventually go to the carbs, so let's get them back together. Starting with the T-pieces for the fuel, air and coolant, I worked through them removing the old O-rings. Now Kawasaki don't sell them separately, only as a set with the T-pieces itself, which is quite costly. Fortunately though, there's a seller on eBay that sources the correct sizes and in a modern rubber for a decent price. Looking at the old and new rings to compare, you can see how deformed they are, and looking up close with a microscope, you can see they're definitely worth changing. With those all replaced, I'm confident I won't have fuel leaking onto a hot engine while I'm riding along. So now I can bring all 4 carb bodies back together. Okay, so I've got 4 carburetors, I've got the fuel T-piece, I've got the air breather T-piece, I've got the spring that goes between the 2 outer carburetor pairs, I've got the small tension spring that keeps tension on the adjuster screw on that linkage, I've got the spring, and then I've got the rail and the long bolt that holds them all together. I rubbed a drop of oil on the rings to help them slide in and to avoid them getting pinched. Then starting with the air breather one, I pushed it into the hole on the carb body. Then I did the same with the fuel T-piece. I grabbed the spring and sat it on the throttle pivot, and then brought the neighbouring carb body down onto the 2 pipes in the spring. With a bit of gentle pressing, the pipes all pushed home. Then I moved on to the other side. Next I brought the 2 pairs together and aligned them and turned them upside down. I fitted the long bolt through first and tightened it up finger tight. And then I turned them back around to fit the rail. With the rail on, I nipped up the long bolt, and that's the bodies back together. Last thing to do is fit the tension springs that go between the throttle linkages. This can be a fiddle, but a good method is to drop them down the shaft of a small screwdriver to get them onto the nipple on one side. Then I use a larger flathead to jimmy the other side into place. You can spin the adjuster screws out to make it easier, but I find this easy enough to do, and it keeps them in the ballpark of being synced, at least enough to run so I can fine tune them properly later. With all 3 in, I gave the throttle pulley a push to test they all move freely and there's no play. Great. While I was enjoying the beautiful butterflies, I realised I'd forgotten to fit the fucking choke plungers. I couldn't snug them up properly while assembled, so I separated them, fit the plungers and put them back together. Where was I? Ah yes, choke. I fitted the 3 plastic washers to the mounting points, then hooked the rail onto the plungers and down on top of the plastic washers. I put the upper washers and bolts on the top and tightened them up. Finally, I hooked the spring onto the rail and the carb body. A quick test and it all moves freely. Getting the air ducts back into the plate was more fiddly than getting them out, but I worked through them, making sure they were all in the right orientation. I picked up new O-rings for the airbox manifold. So I checked they were all in the right place and fitted the manifold. Once it was down, I had a quick check underneath to make sure none had been pinched or come out of their grooves. They were all good, so I span in the bolts that mount it to the carb bodies. Next up, I took the new foam gasket and routed it into the groove. Next, I pressed the air breather hoses into the T-pieces between the carbs, as this will be harder to do once the diaphragm covers are on. Now I tracked down the instructions for the Dynojet Stage 1 kit, and they say to put the E-clip in the 4th groove from the end. They're currently on the 3rd, and I'm hopeful that raising them one notch will account for the potential lean condition from the freer flowing pipe when it's running on the needle jet. The instructions also say to stack the shim washers behind the clip, unlike either side like they were when it came apart. I fit the needle holder and inserted the needle into the slide. With the spring in behind, I inserted the slide into the carb body, being sure to get it the right way round. I fit the spring to the cover and carefully lowered it on, making sure the cutout was lined up with the vacuum port and that the edge of the diaphragm was in the groove. I span in 2 opposing screws to hold even pressure on the spring, then fit and tighten the rest of the screws. I checked the slide was closing smoothly. If it doesn't, it's a good sign the diaphragm's pinched, but this looks good, so I moved through the rest. This screw has a spacer as it serves as the mount for the clutch cable bracket. With them all nipped up, I span the carbs round and gave the slides a few tests to check they all returned evenly and smoothly. All good. Next bit's to go in with the emulsion tubes, which I span in and then nipped up snug. You don't need to go mega foot-pounds on these bits, just nipped up is enough. Next, the pilot jets went in. I'm keeping these at the stock size, as the research I've done on this exhaust setup suggests keeping these and turning out the mixture screw to dial in the pilot circuit. With the main jets, I'm also going to go up one size to the Dynojet 138s. This may be a step too rich, but if so, I can always swap back to the 136s when I'm dialing it in later. I'm planning to make a whole video of the tuning process once I've worn in the engine, if it even starts. Next up, I gathered the rebuild kits for the float bowls, which included new float valve seats, but these don't come with the gauze filters, so I transferred them over from the old ones. These just press in, and then I fitted the new retaining screws to replace the old corroded ones. With the seats in, I fitted the new float needle valves to the tabs, checking the spring-loaded plungers on the top were working properly. I dropped the needles down into the seats and fitted the floats with the pins and nipped up the retaining screws. I checked the float heights on disassembly, so I just checked that they all move freely and together and then moved on to the float bowls. I fit the new gaskets into the groove. Now these look symmetrical, but they're not, so you have to make sure you've got them in the right way around, otherwise they'll want to pop out of the groove. With the last bowl on, I fit the drain screws. Next I moved on to the pilot mixture screws, fitting the spring, washer and the new O-ring. I wound these all the way in, then backed them out to the setting that they were at before, 2 3/4 turns out. The carb heating circuit went together next. This is something that I don't really need to have, as this bike won't really be heading out in colder temperatures, but I'm installing everything initially, and I'll make further mods like removing this and the clean air system once it's all up and running. Then I finished these off with their retaining brackets. Then I finished up the underside with those little plastic guides for the drain screws. I fitted the pipework for the float bowl breathers. And then last but not least, I fitted the fuel feed hoses. With the clamps in, that's the carbs fully reconditioned, ready to go back on the bike. Well, almost. Before I put them on the bike though, I rigged up an auxiliary fuel tank with the old hoses and filter, and ran fuel to them to check for any leaks. I'll leave them like this for a few hours to be certain, as it's definitely my preference to find out I've got a leak now rather than when I've spent ages fitting them to the bike. So far so good. While I waited, it's a good time to fit the cleaned up pipework and the valve for the clean air system. As I said, I'll likely come back in here and move this down the line. Test fitted the vacuum hoses to the inlets to make sure they all lined up correctly, then pulled them off again to allow for the carb sinking later on. Finally, I fitted the crankcase breather hose. Good news, I had no leaks on the carbs, so I drained the fuel and gathered up the next few bits I need to get fitted to get the bike up and running. So the next video will either end with the bike running or me screaming into that bin. But that's the problem for 2026. Have a Merry Christmas and I'll see you in the new year.